Don't try to with me.
An 8-year-old was only 6 years old when he witnessed his mother's murder. He would become the sole witness against her killer and would testify even though the defense claimed that there wasn't any possibility that he actually remembered what had happened. In his hour testimony, he would prove them entirely wrong. Strangely enough, his mother had previously watched her killer on the news when a live murder trial was being held, and he wasn't the criminal at that time. He was actually the prosecutor. As you can tell, this is one insane story, and I just want to let you know that it's very emotional, and a lot of the victim impact statements are heartbreaking. This little boy's testimony is gut-wrenching, and I think it's so important because of that, because you can tell just how much this woman's death affected her entire family, and it could have been prevented. In fact, if there wasn't a certain individual who decided that she needed to not live on this planet anymore, she would still be with us today and would have still been able to raise her sons. So this one gets me really fired up. It is a murder that happened around Thanksgiving, and so because Thanksgiving's coming up, I wanted to do this case in honor of Sara Tokars. She deserves all of the attention and all of the justice. But before we dive into the story, a quick mention of our sponsor, Lumi. Now, Lumi is like that trustworthy friend that's never going to let you go out smelling bad. Lumi has been my go-to for pre- and post-workout routines. Not only do they have the all-body deodorant in stick form, but they have my new favorite, the whole-body deodorant in spray form. So easy to use. This one smells like lavender and it smells amazing. And you're ready to go. They also have deodorizing wipes that you can take with you on the go, or if you are going to take a shower. The acidified body wash has made me sure that I'm not going to be carrying around those odors the rest of the day. I don't know about you, but I'm always worried about smelling bad, and it's not even just from workout odors. It can be odors such as stress. But I know that since Lumi was invented by an OBGYN, Shannon Klingman, for pits, privates, and beyond, it's clinically proven to block odor all day and controls BO for 72 hours. And they have aluminum free available as well if that is more your style. But right now, Lumi has some holiday bundles where you can stock up on your own products or maybe get some stocking stuffers. And Lumi's holiday bundles are up to 40% off right now. And Lumi is giving my subscribers who are either new or returning customers an extra $5 off and free shipping on any $30 bundles. All you have to do is go to the link in my description and use the code BMcKenna. It's a great savings and can be for yourself a little treat or for somebody else. Now let's get back to the story. So the night after Thanksgiving in 1992, an Atlanta homeowner would open his door to find two very young boys splattered with blood. One stated, "A bad man shot my mom." The homeowner asked him to repeat what he had just said because he had been hard to understand due to being terrified, and then he repeated, "A bad man shot my mom, a bad black man with a pirate gun." When this homeowner followed the boys to the crime scene, it was a car in the middle of a nearby field. They opened the driver's side door and the body of a woman fell out. That was the body of their mother. There was vomit inside from these two young boys who had witnessed this murder. You see, in 1992 in Georgia, the Tokars family lived in Marietta. This was 39-year-old Sara, her husband Fred, and their sons who were just 6 and 4 at this time, who were Ricky and Michael. Now, Sara was known to be a homemaker and was dedicated to being involved in her son's schools as well as the church. She had actually met Fred 8 years prior in 1984. Sara actually grew up in Florida, and she was working as an elementary school teacher, but she actually moved to Georgia in 1981 with her first husband. They had met at the beach, and he was an Atlanta health club owner, so Sara moved with him and began to teach aerobics at her husband's club. Now, they eventually divorced due to her husband's affairs, and in 1984, Sara would meet Fred. They were an average family, not very notable, just peaceful and normal. Until November 29th of 1992, Sara was headed back home from a weekend at her parents' home with her two boys for Thanksgiving. Their father, Fred, had to work that weekend, so he wasn't able to stay the full time. So 2 days prior, Sara had actually packed up her and the boys and driven to Bradenton, Florida, stopping at the Tampa airport to pick up Fred, who was staying for that short time for Thanksgiving, and then he had to head back to get back to work. But this was going to be before Sara and the boys were ready to leave, which is why he was flying. But Sara and the boys had headed home, and they had never made it there. Her children would knock on the stranger's door and tell them that their mother had been shot. This traumatized 6-year-old boy would then tell the police that when they arrived at their home that evening, they had opened the garage door and found a man with a gun. He ordered them back into their vehicle, and he told their mother to drive as he sat behind her holding the gun to her. The 6-year-old said that his 4-year-old brother was sleeping at the time, unaware what was going on, and Sara was forced to drive further into the city, and then he began to tell her to pull over the car and turn off the car. Now, Sara actually refused, and that is when the 6-year-old said that this man shot her in the back of the head. The 6-year-old boy explained that this man got out of the car with the gun, leaving them in as the car was still on, and began to roll away down the hill. Now, he had learned how to put the car into park or turn the car off through his mother, and so he was able to turn the car off, get his little brother out, and go and ask for help. 911 was called by that homeowner, and they found that a shotgun had been used on Fred Tokars. They began to sweep the car for any evidence, and the 6-year-old was telling investigators just what his mother's killer looked like. He described him as a black male wearing jeans, a sweatshirt, and a cap. So Cobb County Sheriff's Office put Detective Pat Banks on the case. He arrived at the scene, and he found that inside of this vehicle was lots of blood that was even on these two boys, and this was along with fragments of Sara's skull and brain, which was also on her son's.
One thing I always remember was she had long hair, and the blood would just run down, and just the droplets would drop off of. The children hadn't been physically hurt, but the first thing I noticed when the ambulance doors opened up was the smell of vomit. Michael's shirt was off, and he had gotten sick. They both spattered with their mother's blood.
But there was no shell casings, and so Detective Banks then decided to search the Tokars family home, as that is where the killer had allegedly bombarded them and kidnapped them from. He would find that the sliding glass door to the back of this home was unlocked. They had a security bar there, but it was no longer attached to keep the door closed. He found that the door from the garage inside of the home, that knob was actually reversed, meaning that it was impossible to lock the door from the inside of the residence. This was very peculiar, but it didn't give much information. This just could be something that was odd in this home. But the home security alarm also was not activated that night, so it didn't alarm. There were also no fingerprints found at the home either.
The first impression was that the scene was staged to make it look like a burglary, and it was not a burglary.
Now, of course, the husband, Fred, was the first person of interest a spouse normally is, even though he did not match the description that his son had given. But Fred was working out of town that weekend, which was confirmed. He was all the way in Montgomery, Alabama, talking to a client of his, and we will get into all of that in a bit. But the boys were sent to relatives as the investigation began, and before their father could obviously arrive home. So investigators began to wonder if this was a robbery gone wrong, because Sara didn't appear to have any enemies that would have wanted her dead. The only theory that they had was that maybe one of her husband's clients got involved. A possible retaliation from an angry client. You see, Fred was actually a defense attorney. He would fight for criminals in court. The opposite of a prosecutor who would fight to put the criminals away, he would stand up for them. So his clients were actually usually the bad guys, and he was trying to keep them from going to prison. Most of these criminals might have a motive of revenge if they had been done wrong, but so far there were no leads pointing to this. Fred rushed home from Montgomery, Alabama to his sons. He agreed to sit down with investigators. He had his own attorney already. That was the first call that he had made. So he was said to be a babbling, sobbing mess, and investigators even smelled beer on his breath. Now, Fred told investigators that he would do anything to help find his wife's killer, and that they had a very solid marriage. He then walked them through the family home and said that over that weekend when Sara and the kids were at the in-laws' house and when he was at work, they didn't set the alarm because they had actually scheduled for a plumber to come while they were gone. He said he wasn't sure if that security bar on the sliding glass door had actually been placed there and been taken off, or if it wasn't there at all. Fred would also lead investigators downstairs to the basement, which is where he had his own office, and he also had a safe, which he opened and claimed was empty and that it might have had $1,500 in it. He wasn't sure, but he did say that the combination was in a nearby file that his wife knew about. So he wasn't sure if maybe his wife was forced to get money out of the safe or if the criminals found the combination themselves. But detectives also found it very strange that Fred didn't know much about his own home. He didn't know little things like if anything was stolen or if this was where it normally would sit in the home. But due to his job, he wasn't home very much either. A sketch was then made with the 6-year-old Ricky of his mother's killer, and this man had allegedly been seen in the neighborhood prior to the kidnapping, but other than that, there were no tips. Sara's family were immediately informed, and they rushed from Florida to Georgia. Her parents remembered that when Sara had come with the boys for Thanksgiving, she had gotten a call the day prior to her heading home. This was around 1:30 in the morning. A fire alarm had actually gone off in their home, and the security company had called her, but there was no fire. Then 6 hours later at 7:30 in the morning, a second alarm sounded. Sara answered the phone and ended up telling her parents that her and Fred had decided to just turn the alarm off, believing that this was a series of false alarms. The next day, around 12:45 in the afternoon, Sara and the boys had headed home. They had a very long drive. Fred had already left to go to his job, and so Sara and the boys were all singing "We'll Be Home for Christmas." And then Sara's father received a call from Fred asking when Sara and the boys were going to be home. Fred had actually gone back to their home and had to leave that afternoon for work, and so he was told that Sara and the boys would arrive home by 9:30, 10 p.m. Sara had promised to call her father as soon as they arrived home, but the call never came, so when they tried calling her, the line was busy every time they called. Fred wasn't home because, like I said, he had already left for Montgomery, Alabama to talk with a federal prison inmate about becoming his attorney. But when Fred arrived back home after finding out about his wife's murder and his wife's family was there, they said that Fred was acting very strange. He couldn't control his emotions. He was sobbing, but he just kept saying, "I want my mommy." And so finally, they got in touch with his mom, Norma, and he literally did not stop crying until she arrived to console him. Sara's family, her father and her sisters, would tell the police that Sara was the Catholic daughter of a surgeon and a middle child in a family of 7 sisters. She desperately wanted a marriage like her parents, a childhood for her kids that was just like hers, because she had just this dream life growing up, and her parents were so happily in love. She was 31 when she met her second husband, Fred, and she was ready to have kids. It was the most important thing to her. She had seen Fred as a family guy. He had come from a family like her own. She was very grateful to have found him, and within a year they were married, and a few months later she was pregnant with their first child. Now, they purchased a home in Kings Cove, and they had their first son, Ricky. Sara continued half days at her office job, and the rest of the time she would be home with Ricky, but then she lost her job. And so she became a housewife, and 2 years later they had their second son, Michael. Sara's sister said that Fred not only had his own defense attorney practice, but that he was also teaching law school at night on classes such as accounting, tax, law enforcement, money laundering. His nickname by his coworkers was actually Fast Fred due to his eagerness to work on so many different projects. He never slowed down. But Sara's sisters said that Sara did not fall in love with him for the money or for his work ethic or because he was this prominent defense attorney. It was actually the complete opposite. You see, the reason that Sara and Fred were even together was that 8 years prior, she had been watching the news when there was a live murder trial playing about an Atlanta attorney who had been killed by his lover. That is when she saw Fred, who at the time was not a defense attorney for the criminals, but a prosecutor trying to put them away. During his trial, he was actually a junior prosecutor assisting, but when Sara saw him, she recognized him. They had gone to school together. They didn't really know each other, but this made her feel that childlike joy again. And she had adored that he was fighting to put criminals away. He had very good moral standards. He had a good moral character, and this was part of his appeal. So Sara actually decided to call him one night, which turned into a date and then to marriage. But he had since switched sides and become a defense attorney. And so after the murder, Sara's sisters actually entered the police department with a file. They all began to say that Sara was not a happy wife. Fred was not attentive, was rarely home, did never eat dinner with the family. Sara was raising the boys practically by herself, and they claimed after her firstborn son, Ricky, was born, Sara wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, but Fred got upset that she did not want to work. And then when Sara lost her job, Fred had switched from working as a prosecutor to a defense attorney in his own office. But what they were giving in this file, they said, was because 3 years prior to her murder, Sara had begun collecting information on her husband that she was giving to her sister in case anything happened to her. She told her sister to give it to the police. Inside this file was Fred Tokars' bank accounts and balances, but even her sisters didn't really understand what this was for. You see, the sisters claimed that Sara was worried about her husband's new clients, and she suspected that some of those criminals that he was working for were actually dealing drugs, as Fred was often paid in cash. But this was just the beginning of her suspicions of the illegal activity that Fred was into. Sara no longer saw Fred as someone who was making the world a safer place, and around this time when Sara lost her job, he actually put her on a budget, more like an allowance, so she had to pay with a small amount of money the groceries, the bills, and any household maintenance that was needed. If she needed more money, she had asked Fred, and he often turned her down. Fred refused to pay for any updates on the home, and it was getting pretty old and run down. He didn't care to take care of this home, and it was very obvious. Sara was unable to have her own credit cards or accounts, and she couldn't make purchases without approval. She would have to submit budgets to Fred to get anything, and they were often rejected or partially given. Sara was completely unaware of the family's finances, and not because she didn't want to know. Anytime she asked, she would be shut down, and then she was also banned from the basement home office where Fred kept all of the files. Sara was also unable to see her family in Florida. She was very close with them, but this was a costly trip, and Fred would not give her any money for her trip home. So she would often save her money, and he would fly while he would make his wife and his children drive the 9 hours to get there. So about 3 years before her murder, she had begun to think about divorce. She wrote a will for her sons. She revoked all prior wills and left her property all to her sons. She named her sister Therese as the executor and her boys trustee. The only time she mentioned her husband Fred was when she wrote that her younger sister Karen would be her children's guardians if her husband did not survive her. Fred had also gotten a vasectomy without his wife's knowledge, even though Sara did want more children. So around this time, Sara had begun to work with an attorney who would say that Sara had once told him that she couldn't attend a party that she had RSVP'd to at his home because she wasn't well. When he begged her to come, saying she would have so much fun, she ended up saying, "I can't come because I have bruises on my left arm and side where Fred beat me." Then Sara panicked and said, "You wouldn't say anything about this, would you? Don't even tell Fred I called." But this wasn't the only person with insight into this failing and possibly abusive marriage. A man named Ralph Perdomo would come forward to police saying that he was a PI who Sara had hired to follow her husband. One of the many things that she wondered was if he was having an affair on her. And the PI stated that Fred had told Sara that if she ever tried to leave, he would take her kids away. That he had political contacts and judicial contacts to do it. So the PI remembered Sara showing him her husband's office one day when he was not home and telling him that she wanted to make copies of all these files and find out what they actually meant. The PI told her it would be a violation of the law, but to copy them and give them to someone she trusted if she felt concerned about these, and that is what she did with her sister. So she began to copy Fred's bank files and send them to her sister in order to have this evidence against him in order to get custody of the sons if Fred took her to court. Because Sara believed that her husband was involved in illegal activities, she told the PI to turn over any information that he found on the investigation of her husband if anything happened to her. The PI would find that there was an affair happening with a woman who worked as a stripper, and this woman told the PI that once when they were together, Fred had told her that he was sick of his wife and that he was going to get her out of the way. Sara wasn't the only one with a PI though, and we'll get into that later. At the time of Sara's murder, when Fred had not been charged with anything but definitely was a person of interest, his attorney seemed to have all of the answers to the strange elements of this case. He said the reason why Fred's breath smelled like beer was that he had given him a beer when he arrived home from his work trip because he was in a hysterical state. He also said that Fred had told him that the statements of alleged abuse against his wife were not true. Fred's attorney was not letting Fred be interviewed, but Fred did tell authorities prior to that he had a lot of dangerous criminal clients, including some that had gunned down a man with the same kind of gun his wife had been killed with, alluding to the fact that this could be how his wife was killed.
We've been attempting to get Mr. Tokars to come in and talk to us. We're having a difficult time getting him to come in.
So we explained to him that he should know better than anybody how important it is that we get something rolling right away before the trail got cold.
While he was trying to point them in another direction, investigators found that prior to Sara's death, Fred had taken out 3 life insurance policies totaling $1.7 million in the event of her death. But unless his 6-year-old son Ricky could lie to police, then his father was not the one who murdered his wife that night. Because if you remember, Ricky said that this was a black man who had done this, and Fred was white.
I'd never seen anybody act like him before. He was just more anxious than sad. He never talked about Sara. He never said, "Oh my God, poor Sara. Oh, what she went through. Poor Rick and Mike." He was just all acting like, "I'm scared. I got to get out of Dodge," he kept saying.
So at this point, investigators believe the only lead to go on to find the killer was in that file of bank statements from the victim herself. And so as they scoured these documents, they also sent them to the FBI. And the FBI would find that Fred Tokars had actually set up offshore bank accounts and corporations pointing to money laundering, a subject that he knew well enough about to teach law school classes. As this case became more convoluted and information was coming out, it was shocking the community because Fred Tokars was not only this very prominent defense attorney, but he also served as campaign treasurer for the state Supreme Court justice and was appointed part-time city judge at one point. Little did anyone know at the time that behind the scenes, the Atlanta police were actually looking into Fred for laundering money using Atlanta nightclubs. But now these documents that Sara had copied and other documents found at his firm were pointing to tax evasion as well. A neighbor of the Tokars then came forward to police that a few weeks prior to the murder, Sara had said that she had found documents that pointed to tax evasion and she was going to go to the police with this information to get her divorce. As detectives investigated the tax evasion, they found that Fred himself had hired a private investigator, not to stalk his wife, but actually to go to drug dealers and start talking to them about laundering their profits. You see, Fred was known to be the go-to guy to make tax liabilities go away. He was making thousands off of these nightclubs, hiding the drug trafficking through that money movement. With this secret life, investigators wondered if Fred had something to do with the murder, or if it was these alleged activities that he was into that had gotten his wife killed without his knowledge. Or was it a combination of both to force Sara to keep her mouth shut about the secrets she had found? Well, surprisingly enough, 2 of the drug traffickers would agree to work with investigators under plea deals to charge Fred Tokars. One was a man named Eddie Lawrence who had been working with Fred for about a year. Eddie was known to be a landlord, or more accurately, a slumlord who would barely fix up these properties and then rent them for far more than they were worth. He would then default on the mortgage payments, still taking money from the tenants. He went to Fred to get help with the legal side of things, but instead of just being his attorney, Fred had also gone into business with Freddie, and they created real estate businesses to steal even more money. But once news began to spread that Eddie Lawrence was speaking to investigators, a confidential informant came forward to police saying that they had heard that Eddie Lawrence was looking for a hitman prior to Sara's murder. He had told a coworker that a woman stood in the way of making a lot of money and he wanted to get rid of her. So this woman had given Eddie the name of a hitman. This was 22-year-old Curtis Rower. So Eddie went back in for questioning about the murder, but said that he knew nothing about it. And then on December 16th of 1992, Eddie was arrested with no bail as they began to search for Curtis Rower. Investigators then went to Fred, who was not having many conversations with police at this time, and they showed him a picture of Eddie Lawrence, who Fred did ID.
You know that man?
It's Eddie Lawrence.
This man was never mentioned.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand what you're talking about.
You never told me anything about Eddie Lawrence.
Well, you never asked me anything about it.
They asked him why he never told them about Eddie, and at this point, Fred refused to talk to the investigators. So December 22nd, investigators found a home where Curtis Rower was allegedly staying. When they searched the home, they found him hiding. He was arrested and he was charged with murder. But he was a talker. And he also had a record for smaller crimes like car theft, which he was on probation for at this time. Curtis was now talking to investigators, and he didn't deny being the one to kidnap Sara and the kids, but he said he couldn't go through with the murder. And it was actually Eddie Lawrence who had killed her. He said he went to the Tokars' home, which was left unlocked, and he waited for Sara to come home. That he did kidnap Sara and the kids, but when they stopped, he just couldn't shoot her. Curtis then claimed that Sara was pleading with him, just don't hurt me and the kids. He said that the younger child woke up at one point who was sitting next to him and began tugging on his sleeve, but Eddie was told not to touch the kids. Sara then offered him her purse, her car, begged him to leave. She then shoved the eldest son, Ricky, to the floor, knowing that they were in danger, and she began to scream. But Curtis said that he had made Sara stop where Eddie was parked waiting for them, and then Eddie ran up and was asking Curtis why he was not shooting Sara, and Sara allegedly recognized Eddie and was shocked, like she knew Eddie. She tried to run him over with the vehicle at this time, but as they all began to struggle, Curtis said that the gun went off, killing Sara. The car that was still in drive rolled across the road into the nearby field, and he ran. Now, Eddie refused to talk about these version of events. And then investigators found multiple witnesses who claimed that Curtis, who was a known crack addict, bragged to them about killing Sara. Curtis said at first he believed that Sara was Eddie's ex-wife, and so at this point no one knew the truth on who was the actual killer except for the 6-year-old boy who had witnessed his mother's murder. So Ricky was brought in, and a lineup of men were presented with Eddie and Curtis. He was unable to choose. It was unknown if this was out of fear, out of the fact that he was 6 years old, or that he didn't really get a good look at the killer.
Tokars, do you have any idea who may have wanted to kill Sara?
Just can't even imagine it.
What kind of insurance policies did you have on Sara then?
Sara and I have the same type of insurance policies. One of them is for $250,000. One of them is for $1 million, and I think that there's another one for $500,000. Every marriage has its ups and downs, but I would be shocked if I thought that she was considering a divorce right now from me.
Did she sleep with you?
Yes.
Did she have sex with you?
Yes.
But one thing was known: Eddie Lawrence was not talking until he was promised a plea deal. Eddie began to explain that he owed Fred $70,000 at the time of the murder, which was of course a motive to why Eddie would go to these lengths to hire a hitman for a man wanting to kill his wife. It was to pay back his debt, or at least it could have been. It was also found that Fred had promised to give Eddie half of his wife's life insurance policy toward his businesses. So eventually, Eddie would confess that Fred had given him $25,000 up front for his wife's death. Eddie had tried to talk Fred out of it, but Fred wanted it done, and so he wanted Eddie to stage it as a robbery when Fred was out of town. He was to do it in front of the kids, with Fred saying the kids would get over it. The day before the murder, Eddie said that Fred called him, and he said that it was to talk about fixing the broken water heater, but Eddie refused to do so, and so the day of the murder, they had also had another phone call where Eddie said they talked business, but he said nothing important really transpired during that call. But Eddie said he decided that he didn't want to commit the murder himself and that he was going to get someone else to do it. He knew this guy, Curtis Rower, was a former inmate, a crack addict, and he agreed to kill Sara Tokars for $5,000. Eddie then admitted to meeting Curtis after Curtis killed Sara and drove him away from the scene, but he did not say anything about being involved in the murder. Sara's parents claimed that they were with Fred when Fred heard the news about his wife's killers being arrested. He said he was anything but relieved. In fact, he had quickly left his in-laws' home that day, leaving the kids behind, and then refused to answer all cell phone calls. He would be found in a hotel room, unconscious from an alleged overdose on pills, and there was a suicide note as well. This was not any sort of confession. He had written that Sara was a great woman, and he apologized for the pain and suffering his lifestyle inflicted on his family. But Fred Tokars would survive this attempt. On December 31st, Fred Tokars held a press conference in Atlanta, Georgia, and he begged the media to leave him alone. He said his wife's murder had cost him his whole lifestyle.
I emphatically deny any involvement in my wife's murder, and any suggestion that I might have been involved in any way deeply hurts me. Unfortunately, after drinking too much and after taking some back pain medication, I became very depressed and started to think of the lifestyle that I was losing. Not only my wife, but my whole lifestyle.
He closed his law practice at this time. He placed the family home on the market. He rented a dumpster and threw out everything that they were not taking with them. He then moved to West Palm Beach with his mother, Norma, and his boys were left in the care of Sara's family. He would visit his boys about twice a month, and he would often tell Sara's family he had nothing to do with the murder and that his counselor told him to start looking forward, not back, and that is why he was not talking about it with anybody. But Eddie Lawrence's plea deal that he had entered sentenced him to 12.5 years if he would give testimony against Curtis Rower and testimony against Fred Tokars. So Curtis Rower ended up pleading guilty, and his trial began with Curtis claiming that the only witness of this murder, Sara's 6-year-old son Ricky, couldn't have remembered anything, that he was lying. Ricky Tokars, a now 8-year-old little boy, took the stand, and he confirmed he had only ever seen one man that night. He said that he was going to get help because his grandfather was a doctor, so he was going to have whoever he got help from call his grandpa. And this was to make his mother better. Now, we will get more into Ricky's testimony and how powerful it really was here in a bit. But Curtis's lawyers were arguing that Eddie Lawrence was in the car with them when they parked, and he was the one that pulled the trigger. His first trial actually ended in a mistrial, and in his next trial, Curtis escaped the death penalty and was sentenced to life without parole. But what about Fred Tokars? Well, they decided they were going to arrest him, but he was with his sons during this time. So in order to arrest him, investigators posed as reporters to get Fred to come out of the home and away from his children. They feared that he would hurt them as well. And that is when he was arrested, but not for murder. This was for money laundering, racketeering, and murder for hire.
Fred's suicide attempt showed two things. One, that he was involved, and that he was guilty, and he knew that they were closing in on him. And two, that we had to just be so careful with the boys because we felt that the boys were not safe with Fred.
On August 25th of 1993, a federal grand jury indicted Fred and alleged that he served as an attorney for the criminal enterprise that distributed cocaine and laundered the money through nightclubs that were incorporated by Fred and his associate, Eddie Lawrence. He then invested this drug money in offshore bank accounts, and he was pleading not guilty to this. Fred claimed he was not aware that there was any sort of illegal activity and did not knowingly launder any money or have any part in plotting his wife's murder. In 1994, he was found guilty of racketeering and sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences.
I can't look at Fred. All I thought to myself the whole time they were reading guilty, guilty, guilty was after Sara was murdered, we all felt so bad that we weren't there to help her or protect her.
There would be a separate trial for the charges of murder for hire. So in 1997, the prosecution was aiming for the death penalty for plotting to kill his wife. This was televised on court TV.
Fred talked about taking care of Sara. Did Fred say anything about who might do it?
Eddie Lawrence.
And did Fred say anything about why he was choosing Eddie Lawrence?
Because he owed him money.
He was a judge, and he had a lot of influence in Atlanta. He would cover it up. I didn't think that would work. If I did it, he would give me $25,000 if I didn't get caught. Then he would give me the life insurance money, $1 million, end quote. Tokars would go to Alabama to meet some guy in jail, and that would be his alibi, end quote. Quote, you heard about the murder? It's a tragedy, isn't it? Then he said he was going to Florida for 3 months, and that he'd be back.
And while they didn't have his son Ricky actually testify against his father, they did end up reading the transcript of the previous testimony, which is how we know in its entirety what Ricky said. Ricky had stated that they had driven up to the garage, the light was on, and his mom and himself and their dog had gotten out of the car to go inside. As they opened the door, the bad guy with a gun then told them all to get back in the car, to give him the money, and that no one would get hurt. Ricky stated that the gun he was carrying looked like a pirate gun to him, and Ricky said that the bad man told his mother to drive, and while they were driving, Ricky accidentally rolled that automatic window down with his arm, and the man yelled at him to roll it back up, which he did. Ricky said that then the bad man wanted his mother to take a turn, but she was begging him just to drop him off there because she was scared. And that's when Ricky said, the man said, "Don't F with me." And Sara said she wasn't.
Don't try to with me.
And what did your mom say?
I'm not trying to with you.
Shortly after, he shot the gun, and Ricky explained that he felt the bump of the car, which began to roll down the field. And as it came to a stop, he knew his mother was dead.
I sort of seen if my mom was still awake or if she was dead, and then I woke my brother up, and
you woke your brother up?
Yeah, and then I told him we had to go get help, and then we went to go get help.
Now, when Ricky was asked where his mother went, he stated, "Up to heaven, I guess." He said the bad man then started running after a couple of seconds, and he said he only ever saw one man, but he thought he might have seen another light, such as another car's light nearby. Ricky explained that he had to see if his mother was dead or alive, and then he woke up his little brother to get help. He had actually turned off the ignition of the car to make sure that it wouldn't keep rolling, and he had done this because he had seen his mother do it all the time. They then ran to the closest house that had the lights on and got help from the people inside. Then on cross-examination, he was told that if he got scared, he could tell them. So the defense asked if he remembered the detectives who had questioned him, and he did remember Detective Pat Banks. Ricky was questioned a little on the inconsistencies, and he was told that the first time that he gave a statement, he told the officers that his mother had pushed him on the floorboard, but he didn't state that again. And they were saying maybe he forgot, and Ricky started getting frustrated with the defense, and that his mother's killers were trying to prove that he didn't remember things correctly. He said he did remember. He said he remembered because it's like when you hit a home run. You remember that. And that's what he remembered with his mom.
Yeah, but you know how you, the first time you hit a home run? Like that? You, always remember that, don't you?
Yeah, it sticks out in your memory, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's, what it was when my mom is.
At 8 years old, he was adamant about what he had seen, and he was not letting them get away with it. It was asked if he knew why it was important, whether he knew that there was one guy or more, and he said yes, because someone else was saying that they were there. But he stuck to his statement. He only remembered one man, and when asked if his Aunt Joni, who was the one taking care of them now, wanted him to say these things, he said no. Ricky was a little spitfire. He was so strong on that stand for his mother, and he was certain of what he had seen, and that it was Curtis Rower that killed his mom. Fred's mother, Norma, then testified and begged the court not to kill her son. They were stating that the boys shouldn't lose both of their parents.
Please don't kill my son. I beg you to spare my son's life. To lose my son, Fred, by the death penalty, I couldn't bear it.
When the victim impact statements came into play, they would be incredibly hard to watch. One was from Ricky's cousin, Derek, and Derek would say, "Every day when I walk to class, I'm surrounded by normal people, but I just don't feel normal anymore. When my aunt was taken from us, my life changed forever. Along with the death of Sara is the death of part of my soul." He spoke about at family gatherings, Sara was always with the kids, that she had so much love to give, and she never went anywhere without a smile. Sara's sister, Joni, her testimony was incredibly emotional. She had taken over the motherly role for Ricky and Michael. She was the younger sister of Sara, and she said, while the world was watching football games, Ricky was trying to pick out his mother's killer. He was scared and had to be lifted by me to see anything. On the way home, he sat on my lap and got scared when we got too close to home that his grandparents would be murdered, and then we would be too. We had to stop at a payphone to call his grandparents to confirm they were okay. We had to do this yet again, and we told the grandparents to turn on the lights and wait outside for us. She said, Ricky and Mike are overwhelmingly sad and depressed. It's difficult for them to talk about their mother. When we try with Ricky, he puts his hands over his ears and begs us to stop. We have to sit in their rooms before they fall asleep, and we have to get home before it's dark out so the boys don't get scared. The whole family has to be a part of easing the terror of Ricky for him to fall asleep, even with all of the help that they have tried to get with therapists and even priests. Joni was saying that she feels guilty about talking about her own pain when there is so much pain around her, but she left her entire life, her job, her new husband, to be there for Ricky and Mike. She never went back. Jonah and Sara's father actually has lost an intense amount of weight and will talk to and pray to Sara's photo on the wall. She said that he is a shell of a person. Joni said that she hasn't heard her mother laugh in 4 years. Joni cried as she said the number one thing that Sara wanted was that her boys were safe. She taught them any safety tips she could find, and she took them everywhere. Unfortunately, when Sara's husband and their father hired a hitman, he ripped away that safety from them forever. Fred Tokars was sentenced to life, and immediately he turned to his mother in the courtroom.
We, the jury, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the offender caused or directed another to commit murder. We, the jury, have found beyond a reasonable doubt that one or more of the alleged statutory aggravating circumstances do exist, and we recommend a life sentence to be imposed.
He looked for his mother seated behind him in the courtroom.
And he turned around and whispered, "I'm okay, I love you," to his mom.
Fred knew that Sara and Rick and Mike were going to walk into that house that night. He knew that Rick and Mike were going to be there. And we can't understand how anyone can plan the murder of a young mother like that and be spared. Who was there to spare Sara? No one was there to show Sara any mercy.
Ricky and Michael, who had witnessed their mother's murder, were raised by Sara's family. They were growing up to be very good, mature men. Ricky was working as an EMT, and in 2015, there was actually an interview with Atlanta Magazine where Michael talked a little bit about what he remembered. He said that although he wasn't awake for most of the murder, he did remember some things. He remembered waking up in the back seat in the garage and a strange man coming out of the house. He remembered the man kicked their dog, got in the back seat, and he remembered when his brother got him out of the back seat to get help, Michael sensed that his mother was already dead. Then he said they ran about 100 yards with blood on them. Then the next morning, he remembered having breakfast with the family, and they were all talking about how if Fred had only been there with his gun, he could have stopped the murder. Of course, this was before they realized what actually happened. But Michael said that throughout the years, Ricky didn't talk much about what happened. Michael said his father is no longer a good guy in his eyes, and they do not have any contact with him. Ricky went to college in San Diego and became an EMT, and Mike went to the University of South Florida and became a journalist. Over the years, Fred Tokars was placed in witness protection in the federal prison system and diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. He also became a prison informant, testifying against other inmates in order to hope to get his sentence reduced. He allegedly helped to solve 6 murders, which got no time off of his sentence, saying that he was doing this to show his boys that he could do something good. In 2020, Fred died in prison. He had developed a fever, he was hospitalized, but his cause of death was not specified. It was believed to be natural causes. His lawyer claimed that Fred suffered from a neurological disease that destroyed his body, that he hadn't walked in 10 years, and Sara's sister came forward at this time and said that he should have died in an electric chair 28 years ago. That the pain and suffering he caused those little boys and the family was and continues to be immeasurable. A month prior to Fred's death on April 3rd, 2020, Michael Tokars, the youngest son, also died. This was of a pulmonary embolism at the age of 31. Channel 2 Atlanta News interviewed a friend of the boys who claimed that the boys never had any interaction with their father again, that there wasn't a reason for them to get to know him. And after Michael died, his family actually set up a GoFundMe to support the family. And on there, it spoke a little bit about Michael. It said he was an eloquent writer, gifted artist, voracious traveler, avid surfer, and music enthusiast. During his short life, he explored paths in Atlanta, New York City, and Los Angeles, and met countless meaningful friends along the way. However, he always considered Bradenton, Florida, and its community to be home. During Mike's interview before his death, he spoke about facing evil at such an early age, saying, "I don't take anything for granted. Don't expect to be comfortable or safe. When you're in the water, you always worry that there is a shark, but there's a calmness when you actually spot the fin. You know the evil is there." And I could not find any more about Ricky Tokars, and I just want to say if he happens upon this video, I want him to know that he is incredibly strong, that he does not have to talk about it, that he doesn't have to face it, but he also doesn't have to run from it. He doesn't have to feel guilty. There was so much that this little boy went through to get his mother justice, and he is one of the huge reasons that his mother did get justice. And what he did is something that his mother would be so proud of. And I really, really hope that one day he and his mother can be reunited. This little boy, you could tell, had so much anger in him, an anger that wasn't even going to let these grown people in court tell him what he saw. He was insistent of what he had seen for his mother because it was the truth. And that anger, I'm sure, has grown over the years, and I just hope that he is in a good place and that he is surrounded by people that he loves, the people who love him deeply, because he is the sort of man that would do anything for those that he loves. He is a soul that deserves only the best in life, and I hope that that is what he is getting. I hope that he is allowing that for himself. So don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.